Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi Mesechet Terumot. We're up to Perek Aleph Mishnah Chet. Today's Mishnot shall be Leilu Nishmat Neria ben Svetlana Aranbayv Menuchato Began Eden Amen, and Leilu Nishmat Eliyahu ben Bucha Menuchato Began Eden Amen. In Mishnah 4, we discussed the case of designating olives as terumah for olive oil, which we said was forbidden, because a person cannot designate unprocessed produce like olives as terumah for processed produce like olive oil. The following Mishnah is going to deal with the opposite case, where oil was designated as terumah for olives. The Mishnah says, "En tormin shemen al zitim anichtashin, v'lo yain al anavim anidrachim." One may not separate olive oil as terumah for olives that will be crushed, and one may not separate wine as terumah for grapes that will be pressed. The Mefarshim say that this is forbidden because a person cannot designate processed produce like oil or wine as terumah for unprocessed produce like olives that will be crushed for their oil or grapes that will be pressed for their wine. However, if one did separate terumah in either of these cases, his terumah is valid, but he must separate terumah again after the olives are crushed or the grapes are pressed. The first terumah, which was separated before the olives were crushed or the grapes were pressed, is valid from the Torah biblically, but the Chachamim required a second terumah to be separated. Let us explain the case. Now, if you remember, this Mishnah is addressing the case of designating oil as terumah for olives, right? And it says here that the designation b'diavad is effective. But in Mishnah number 4, which was the opposite situation, designating olives as terumah for oil, that Mishnah said that even b'diavad your terumah is invalid. Now, the Rav says that the reason for this difference is that giving a Kohen olives instead of oil, like in Mishnah 4, it causes him a loss because really he is entitled to receive oil as terumah, and now he is burdened with the task of pressing the olives to extract the oil. Therefore, to protect the interests of the Kohen, the rabbis decree that the terumah is invalid. But if one gives him the oil, like in our Mishnah, which he does not have to process, the terumah is valid. Now, we said that the first, in this case, b'diavad, where it counts, you have to separate terumah again. The first terumah was biblically valid, but the Chachamim require a second terumah to be separated. According to the Torah law, that second terumah is not terumah at all. Rather, it's teven. Therefore, it cannot be eaten until all the necessary tithes are separated on its behalf from other produce. Now, the Mishnah states two halachic differences between these two portions of terumah. הראשונה מדמעת בפני עצמה, וחייבים עליה חומש, אבל לא שנייה. The first terumah, like other deoraita terumahs, makes other produce midumah on its own, without the second terumah. Meaning, if the first terumah on its own is mixed with ordinary produce, the entire mixture is forbidden. That's what we call midumah, when you have terumah mixed with chulin. Now, the Mefarshim explain, if 1 unit of terumah falls into less than 100 units of chulin, which is ordinary non-terumah produce, the entire mixture is forbidden to non-kohanim. 1 in 100. The Mishnah says that the first terumah makes other produce midumah on its own without the second terumah. The reason for this specific inference that we're making, this comparison, is going to be in contrast with the Mishnah later on in chapter 3, Mishnah 1, which speaks of 2 portions of terumah that make other produce midumah only if both portions fell into it. So here it's telling us the contrast, that it makes other produce midumah on its own, even without the second terumah getting involved. V'chayvin alei chomesh, and if a non-Kohen ate the first terumah by mistake, for example, he didn't know that it was terumah, he's obligated to pay the extra fifth for it, which is a fine that has to be paid if a person mistakenly eats terumah from the Torah. Now the Torah says in Sefer Vayikra, chapter 22, pasuk 1, that if a non-Kohen mistakenly eats terumah, he must give a Kohen produce that is worth the value of the terumah, plus a quarter. This quarter is called the fifth because it's the fifth of the sum total. But the second terumah, which is only rabbinic, it's not subject to either of these halachot, meaning it does not make ordinary produce midumah, and a non-Kohen who ate it by mistake does not have to give the fifth. Now, the Mefarshim point out that in general, the terumah midrabanan, the rabbinic terumah that falls into ordinary produce, does make it midumah, But if you have a general case of produce midrabanan that is teruma midrabanan, if it falls into non-teruma produce, it will make it miduma asul. In our Mishnah's case, where the rabbinic teruma was separated in addition to the biblical teruma, the laws of miduma do not apply. And that is in Rabotai Mishnah Chet. Mishnah Tet continues, now that we discussed situations where designating oil as teruma for olives or vice versa, or wine as teruma for grapes or vice versa is asul, the Mishnah now will give us case, it will present to us a case in which this is permitted. V'tormin shemen al zitim anichbashim v'yayin al anavim la'asotam tzimukim. But we may separate olive oil as teruma for olives that are being pickled, and we may separate wine as teruma for grapes that will be made into raisins. The Mefarshim point out, since these olives and grapes do not require significant processing, separating teruma from them for oil or wine is a case of separating teruma from processed produce for processed produce, which is allowed. Now the Mefarshim say, produce is defined as unprocessed if a significant activity is required to complete its processing. Converting grapes into raisins does not require significant activity. Therefore, these grapes are considered already processed. And that's why it would be allowed to separate olive oil as teruma for olives that are being pickled, and wine is teruma for grapes that are made into raisins, because we consider it separating processed produce for processed produce. Now, the Mefarshim say, the question of whether a person may separate oil as teruma for olives or wine as teruma for grapes depends on what he intends to do with the olives and grapes. For example, if he intends to eat the olives or grapes, in which case they are already processed, the separation is permitted. You could separate the olives on account of the olive oil. But if he intends to crush the olives or grapes, in which case they are not yet processed, the separation is forbidden. The Mishnah now is going to discuss cases where one changed his intent after teruma was separated. If someone separated oil, which is processed produce, as teruma for olives that he intends to eat, which also are processed, or he separated olives that he intends to eat as teruma for other olives that he intends to eat, or he separated wine, which is processed produce, as teruma for grapes that he intends to eat, which are also processed produce, or he separated grapes that he intends to eat as teruma for other grapes that he intends to eat. Now the Mefarshim say, each of these teruma designations is allowed because it involves designating processed produce as teruma for processed produce. The same law applies where the olives are pickled or the grapes were made into raisins, which are also processed, like we said in the first part of the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, but then he changed his mind and decided to press the olives or the grapes for their oil or wine. Therefore, he converted them into produce that is not processed. He does not need to separate teruma again, since the teruma separation was valid when it took place because all the produce involved was processed. It remains valid even after he decides to press the fruits, and thereby changes their status to unprocessed. Nevertheless, since at the time when he did it, it was valid, it stays valid. And that is the Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai La'olam. Amen v'amen.